welcome back to another episode of 2cc's of Fiber Arts. I'm Andrew with Caliri Creations, and I'm here with Kelly from Crocheter. And today we have a potentially controversial topic we want to talk about, and that is gauge swatching. So I know in the community it is like a hot topic. Lots of people think you can't start any pattern without doing a gauge swatch. Other people say it's completely useless and you don't need it at all. So I have some definite opinions here that I'm really interested to share with Kelly, and I'm definitely interested to hear
Ooh.
Kelly's thoughts. So, Kelly, do you do gauge swatching for your projects?
Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm very excited about this because I did not know. You almost gave Kelly during the Granny Squares episode energy there with like, I've got some opinions about gauge swatches.
I do
So
have
I am looking forward
opinions.
to hearing that. Yes. Okay. So, all right, for me in general. So, when I'll say from two perspectives about gauge swatching. One, as a designer, yes, it is imperative. I have to gauge swatch. I literally could not design if I did not gauge swatch. If I just started going with it and saying, I'm just going to randomly decide on some numbers. Even if I'm using the same yarn for a project or something like that, I'll still gauge swatch with it because I'm like, well, I might want to change something like, do I want it to be drapier? Do I want a different hook size? Do I have a different like stitch pattern design in mind where like, you know, this is going to be using more of like kind of a ribbed look, whereas this one's more of a cable look and this one's more this, and they're all going to gauge differently,
Mm-hmm.
even with the exact same yarn and hook. So I'm like,
Oh,
it is
yeah.
imperative. That is how I get my calculations as a
Yes.
maker.
Here it is.
Most of the time, I do not do a gauge swatch. Um, even even for clothing items where I feel like it's probably the most important one to do it, I will still sometimes not gauge
Yeah.
swatch. I'll just start and
Wow.
go from there. And I'll be like, you know what? I have designed something before, so I can use math reasoning to be like, you know what? If this is where my gauge is and this is where their gauge is supposed to be, I just need to grow everything up by that much. Because it's always grow. I'm always having to grow my gauge. Because
Oh,
it's,
yeah.
yeah, anyway.
See, that I'm completely the opposite because so I guess I'll agree with you on the patterns because I always gauge swatch for patterns, if anything, just so I have an accurate number to put on the pattern so that I can say, like, hey, y'all, this is exactly what I did. Here's a picture of my gauge swatch so you guys can literally count on my gauge swatch if you need to. I just like having that security because I'm like, I know I made the gauge swatch right. And I know if you use this
Yes.
gauge, you'll be able to make the pattern. So it's like a sense of security for me there. Now, coming onto the creator side of it, I used to just start all projects and just be like, doesn't matter. Like, I just want to start knitting or crocheting. Like, I don't need to gauge swatch or for anything. But I kind of learned the hard way. And I have
Oh.
very loose tension. So my gauge is often very off, like very, very off. So, for example, I recently made these semi fingerless gloves. So these are
Ooh.
gloves that have full fingers on the pinky and the ring finger, and then the thumb, the pointer
Mhm.
finger, and the middle finger have an open hole at the end. So if you're watching, I can show you what they look
Sorry.
like. Oh, so you can
Yes.
see like two fingers are fully covered and then three are partially out. Anyway, I thought this was a
Yep.
cool design, but for the gauge, it says to use a size US 5 size knitting needle, double pointed needles for this. Well, anyway, I
Okay.
made my gauge swatch using that, and I was like more than a whole inch off. And so I was like, these gloves are not going to fit if I use the same needles. So I dropped down to a 4, and I was still too large on my gauge. Then a 3, and then a size 2, and I didn't have needles smaller than that. And those honestly were
Oh
already
my
like too
god.
thick. Yeah. So anyway, I made this gauge swatch for the gloves. And this gauge swatch is even still slightly too big. So the way I got around
Oh
that
my
is
what?
instead of making a size large glove, which is what I should have had to make, I made a size medium glove. But I only knew to do
Okay.
that because I did a gauge swatch. So all of that to say, I think you can really learn from your gauge swatch, especially for wearable items. I kind of feel like it's critical to make a gauge swatch because you can understand how your gauge is different. And, if you can't match the gauge, maybe you can adjust like the size that you make and that kind of thing.
That's okay. That's very interesting that you say that because for things as small as mittens, gloves, socks, hats, a lot of people there, at least in my like circle of people that I've talked to, will generally be like, oh, you don't have to gauge swatch for those. The gauge swatch is the project itself, because by the time you make a gauge swatch, you would have might as well have made the project. But it's so funny that for you, you're like, no, I
Yeah,
made
no.
several gauge swatches for this single pair of these like semi fingerless gloves. And it's like, whereas most people would have been like, well, they're just gloves. I'll just make them. And if they don't fit, whatever, I'll make another pair because that first
No,
one
no,
was the
no.
gauge swatch itself. And you're like, okay, so that's interesting that, yeah, but you're right. Like, that is a
Really?
great, okay. So well, okay, so I know what I say about like, I generally will not gauge swatch myself. But it's because I'm also familiar with my own gauge a lot of the times. So you went through all those iterations. I would be like, you know what? I pretty much can tell that if I have a 4 millimeter hook or like a US 6, with a certain weight of yarn, each of the different weights, I can generally tell if I'm going to be able to match gauge or if I know it's going to be a bit tighter. So then I'll already go ahead and bump up to be able to like help with that. Um, but then once I bump up, I'm pretty much like, I don't really need to do the gauge swatching. I just know I need to bump up by this much based on my past experience. So then
That's
I'll just
true.
start making it. So for me, I guess like I don't always need a gauge swatch to know what my gauge is going to be.
Uh-huh.
So maybe that's like, yeah, I don't know. That's just maybe like where I was thinking the difference between like where making them for wearables. You're
Yeah.
right. They are pretty essential.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I've gotten burned like one too many
And
times making a project without gauge swatching. Like I made a cardigan, a
yeah.
cabled cardigan, and I just picked the large size because I was like, well, I wear a large, so this is my size. And I just like started knitting with the recommended needles and the recommended yarn. But it turns out I really should have probably gone down like 2 or 3 needle sizes because that cardigan ended up being like bat wings on me or something, It was like huge. I could have flown from a tree wearing it like a flying squirrel. So I'm like, I'm
Oh my
tired of getting
goodness.
to the end of the project and being like, man, I should have done this or I should have done that. And so as I've gotten more advanced in knitting and crochet, I'm like super aware now of how important it is to actually do the gauge swatch beforehand because not only like for wearables I think it's like really important, but I've also been doing them for shawls, and that's kind of one to make sure that like the yarn will look good, but also if you're using multiple colors, that's your opportunity there to kind of use it as like a palette. Do these colors look good together? um, and you can kind of get a look into the future by using a gauge swatch.
So you're saying, so it sounds like you're like kind of almost thinking of gauge swatching for more than just measurement. You're like, it's getting you used to the stitch pattern itself, getting you used to how it
Yeah.
feels, how it's going to look as you produce it. And then also your color paletting. I mean, that makes sense. Like if you're doing color work and you want to see how it's going to turn out with the colors you've chosen and doing that, you're like, well, the easiest way to do it is by testing it out with a gauge swatch before you spend all that time on a giant project. So
Yeah.
literally that probably kind of answered my question that I was going to ask about this was I was like, okay, well, gauge swatching for wearables makes sense, but for things like a shawl, you're like, well, that's going to be flat. But then you made that, sense of like, well, but I want to see how the colors are going to play and all that stuff. What about for blankets? What about for like,
Mm.
Afghans, things like that, where I'm like, the size, the end size doesn't necessarily matter as much. Would you still
Mhm.
gauge swatch?
Now I think I would. And this is like a really recent development for me. And actually it's because I made that Fair Isle steeking sweater earlier this year. I know I talk about that sweater all the time. But when I
It's
finished
a
that
good
sweater, I
sweater.
was it's a good sweater. when I finished that project, I was like kind of disappointed with the fit. Like it does fit me really well, but that was kind of the moment where I was like, maybe I should have done a gauge swatch just because I felt like I got lucky at the end that it actually fit me. And so I was like,
Mhm.
maybe I should have just made sure that it would fit by doing a gauge swatch so that I wouldn't have to feel disappointed at the end or feel like, oh, thank God it fit. You know what I mean? Um,
Right.
plus, I think one really cool thing that I would like to do is um, take all my gauge swatches that I've saved at some point and do a project with those. Whether that's like putting them all together as a blanket, or I just had
Mhm.
this idea recently to like take a gauge swatch like this, for example, and put it in like a
Yeah.
scrapbook and then put like a picture of what I actually made with it, the pattern, any notes I had on the pattern, when I made it. I thought it'd be pretty cute to have like a little scrapbook of all my gauge swatches. Um, Especially
I mean,
for
I've
patterns that I've
seen
given away, like I don't have it anymore. It'd
yeah.
be a nice way to kind of always remember, like, oh, that's the shawl I gave to my grandma or my mom or something.
Oh, that's really sweet. That actually I've seen that idea in things like knitting journals or like crochet journals where you
Yeah.
track your projects and you'll usually include like a little gauge swatch with it. So, but I mean, that would be a great use of it. You would just have to find a physical item that you could do that in because
Yeah.
all those
Yeah.
swatches are going to make it nice and thick.
I know. You'd have
But
to
I
have
think
the
that that would be
swatches at
really
like
cool to
different
have
parts
that.
on the page.
Yes, exactly. Otherwise, it's like one corner of the book, like accordions out, and you're like, ugh, I can't squish this in. But yeah, that sounds
Yeah.
really cute. I mean, that's a really cute idea. But I love that you keep your swatches. I throw mine away. I do not keep them.
What?
I know. I know. I'm like, I've got what I need out of this. I don't need to keep, I cannot,
No.
I do not need to keep everything in my life. Like, I can't hoard everything. It's too much. I have too much stuff anyway. And I have too much
Yeah,
yarn. I have
it's
too
true.
much like projects sitting around. I'm like, I can't also keep every single swatch that I've made, especially
Yeah,
since
that's
being a
fair.
designer. Like, a lot of my swatches were ones that I'm like, I scrapped that whole idea. Like I didn't like how it turned out or whatever. And so I just rip it off. And then I'm like, okay, next one. I don't care to recover the yarn. So it just, and then I'm like, well, then they're just piles of basically trash to me. So then I'm like, all
Yeah.
right, toss it, dump it. It's gone.
Wow. I mean, that I finish my gauge swatches. Like I bind them off and everything. I do it in the stitch that the pattern calls for, and then I bind it off because it also tells me like if the bind off is going to look good. Um, so I mean, I'm talking all high and mighty as if I've been doing this my whole life. This is like very new, like past 6 months development. Oh, but it's just because I've
Gotcha.
seen the
Yeah.
benefit of it. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think gauge swatching is like a really great way to learn about your project before you even begin. And for something like the MCAL, you know, you don't even have the pattern to start. You literally just know that you have the yarn and that they give you like a gauge swatch in the pattern. So it's like a way to kind of get a jump start on the project or get yourself excited about the project before you even have the pattern. So I don't know, it's kind of fun.
Yeah, those are well, no, those are like really excellent points because I think like one thing I know that a lot of the reason why some people, including myself, skip the gauge swatch is because we just are so excited about the project. But I
Yeah.
like that you kind of take the approach of the gauge swatch is like the way to get excited about the project. And I'm not going to get frustrated with the project later because the gauge swatch is where I figured all the parts out that I need to. And now the project itself is pure joy. Um,
Yeah. That's a
that's a
great way
very
of looking
nice
at it.
way of kind of like looking at that. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a great
I
way of
mean,
putting
it's
it.
yeah, I think like kind of like the general idea of like when you engage in fiber arts, a lot of us are okay. So you know how it's like a lot of times people will put themselves in the camp of they are a process knitter versus a product knitter.
Oh,
So
uh-huh.
people who probably don't like to gauge swatch, I imagine lean more into the product knitter or crocheter maker
Yeah.
category. Whereas the people who don't mind the gauge swatching, the frogging, the perfecting, all of that stuff, they're the process creators. So
Yeah, that's a good
I
point.
wonder if whether or not there's maybe something to it there.
Perhaps. I mean, I definitely still love having a final product getting pushed out. That's like kind of the whole
Right.
point of making things, right? Is like you want the end product. But I think, as nice as it would be for me to just sit and like pump out a bunch of products, well, it's not going to do me any good if it doesn't fit. I want to make the product because I want to wear it and show it off and be like, look, I made this and look how nicely it fits. Like, it's way more impressive if you knit something for yourself that actually fits you well, because anyone could knit something that's like super baggy and doesn't conform to
Right.
you. But if you get it to the point where it really fits you, it's like a whole nother layer of something to be impressed at. um so yeah, I think
Yeah.
I'm like shifting away from the product knitter and into like the process, because I just want to make sure that I'm doing it the right way so that I can actually have a product in the end. And not just any product, but one that I can actually stand behind and wear and use. Otherwise, I'm just basically knitting to throw it away in a month because it doesn't fit, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I think that that kind of like connects to almost like a philosophy of fiber arts where you're like, how what am I using fiber arts for? Like what is my purpose for this?
Yeah.
So if it really is just to produce and pump things out, even if it doesn't fit, because I know that there are some people who are like, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with throwing it away. I'm okay with it not coming out perfect or right. I just want to work on something. And so I'm not
Mm,
really concerned with that. So they're like pure process. That might be something where their approach to life is like, I'm just here to enjoy life, enjoy like things that I'm doing. Or I'm like, I need just something to do with myself to keep calm or like to deal with, things at home or just to have something to do. And this feels productive. But then you're right, like
mhm.
people like I'm definitely like I would say a hybrid of product and process because I do like the process, but a lot of times I'm also like I'm really excited about what I'm making in the end. But the
Yeah.
actual physical process itself is very soothing, very comforting. Um, and I think where I was going with that was I was like, I want to continue to get better. So maybe I don't make something perfect that first time, but it helps me learn something from it that I can then make better for my next one. And as a result, I have seen it as well. Like even in my current project, oh my gosh, even with my projects that I've done in the past, they have improved as far as fit because of what
Oh,
I've
yeah.
learned from working on multiples of those. Um, and gauge swatching for each one of those actually helped a lot because
Mhm.
I needed to know ahead of time, like, how is it going to fit? How's it going to drape? How am I going to get the measurements? And I even learned the difference between
Yeah.
like the different types of swatches you had to do, like versus round and row and everything. And it
Yeah.
helped me figure out why my sweaters were not coming out exactly the way that I wanted them to. So,
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
especially with crochet, crochet in the round versus crochet flat, totally different way of laying. So you really would have to kind of understand the gauge swatching of circular versus flat. Because knitting isn't really that
Yeah.
way. It's like basically the same flat and round. But crochet, it like totally
Mhm.
changes the way the stitches lay.
Right. And I literally encountered that in one of my or a couple of my patterns where I was doing rows of single crochet in continuous rounds versus joining and turning. And I did
Uh-huh.
notice my gauge tightened up so much.
Yeah, it
So I
does.
was thinking I was making this like, positive ease sweater. I get down to the yoke and I'm like trying it on and I'm like, this is no ease. Like this is negative ease. How did this become such negative ease? But it's
Wow.
because I
Yeah.
improperly I didn't even make the proper gauge swatch. So I think that's another thing is that I think
Yeah,
some people
true.
they might get like frustrated with a gauge swatch because they're like, my gauge swatches always lie. And it's like, well, but what kind of gauge swatch did you make? Did you practice as if you were going to work in the round versus in rows? Did you actually wash it and block it? Did you make it
That's
big
true.
enough? Because I think some people they're like they get so tired of making the gauge swatch that they're like this big, and it's like that's not going to tell you anything.
Oh,
So
yeah.
yeah. So when you're making gauge swatching itself is actually a skill. Like it's not just something anybody can
Mm,
do. They think like making a gauge swatch, we just assume you know what that means. And it's like, but I've had people, even testers, be like, well, how big do I make it? How many rows do I do? How many
yeah.
stitches? And I'm like, I don't think that matters. You just make it big enough to see your gauge. And they're like, well, I don't know how big that's going to be. And I'm like, oh, okay. So
Yeah, true.
that in and of itself is something like I just take for granted that I'm like, we hear the words gauge swatch, we know exactly what you're supposed to do, but everybody kind of approaches it differently.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I mean, sometimes it is like really intimidating when I open a pattern and it says to do like 40 stitches for 40 rows or something. And I'm like, really? That's a
Oh,
huge gauge swatch. But then I mean, you will get a sense of what the pattern will look like because the stuff in the middle is actually going to lay the right way. Because, with knitting, like stockinette, sometimes like you can see on this gauge swatch, or if you're familiar with stockinette, you know that it curls like all over the place. But in the middle,
yeah.
if you hold the swatch open like this, you can kind of see like in the middle area, oh, this is how my pattern's going to
Mhm.
lay. So it is important to do a big enough swatch because if I did one that was too small, it would just probably be like crumpled into a ball because of the stitch pattern itself.
Yeah, and I could imagine how difficult it would be being like, "All right, time to measure this without stretching and
Oh,
manipulating it." But you're like, you
yeah,
literally have to
yes,
just to open it up. You're like, so it has to
yeah,
be big enough that it doesn't do that. Yeah.
yes.
Oh,
Well,
that's
and that's
happened
the
to me
other thing
before when I've
too.
done like particular types of ribbing. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and that's like you commented on like stretching the gauge swatch. That's something too. Is like, is my gauge swatch? Did I accidentally stretch it? Like, is it the right size still, or have I like accidentally pulled on it too much? Because like all these fabrics that we're making are kind of like loose and like mobile. They're not just like rigid frames,
Yeah.
and they can change shape by stretching them. So yeah, sometimes I make the gauge swatch, and I'm like, okay, let me make sure it's as unstretched as possible so that I can actually measure it and see what I'm
Yes.
working with. But for me, since I have loose tension, I often am like, is it too stretched or am I just like, I still need to go down more needle sizes? Like, how could I possibly
Right.
need to go down even farther? So it's
Yes,
like,
I get
yeah.
that because I've done that before where I gauge swatched and like the original pattern called for like a 4 millimeter hook. I was at a 6.5 millimeter hook and still not meeting the gauge because I was like, that is how tightly I was crocheting. But on top
Yeah.
of that, this was before I even understood like that not all worsted weight yarns are the same. Like we like WPI, like wraps per inch,
Oh,
can like
yes.
drastically change even if they're both a worsted. So I was also using a slightly thinner yarn. So it was
Mm.
already against me. But had I not gauge swatched, that cardigan that I was making was going to be way too small for my friend. Like, so
Oh, wow.
yeah, I was like sitting there being like, and even with the giant hook, I was like, now it's way too loose. I don't want that. I then had to go down back to a regular hook size, use my gauge swatch to then calculate out proportionally how I'm supposed to match the gauge here and adjusted the numbers in the pattern. So had I not gauge swatched, that would have not happened.
Wow.
So yeah. But I think that's another
Yeah.
thing that's part of the skill set of a gauge swatch is that you're like, okay, well, I can't always meet both the row and the stitch gauge. So
Oh,
if I have
yeah.
to
That is true.
sacrifice one, I have to look ahead in the pattern and decide, is it going to be easier for me to make up the difference in rows or the difference in stitches? Most of the time it's the difference in rows. So I'll stick with the
Yeah.
stitch pattern um,
Yeah.
gauge
I
and then
agree.
just adjust for like my rows. But not everybody
Yeah.
knows to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. And well, I do think even gauge swatching in general, I think is something that comes with advancement in fiber art skill. When you first start out, of course, you're just going to make the pattern. I never gauge swatched as a kid or
Yeah.
even as an adult up until like very, very recently. Because I was the same, like, oh, I just want to get started on the project. I want to like dive in and make it. But I think like as you do more and more patterns, you just learn more along the way, and you learn, well, maybe I could avoid this problem if I just made the swatch. And
Yeah.
I did that for a couple projects this year, and the gauge swatch actually only took like an hour to make. So I was like, you know what? It's really
Oh,
not
okay.
delaying me that much to just sit and make the gauge swatch. And then I feel at least like secure in my decisions of needle size and yarn weight and everything. So I think that they can be
Well, that's
super
good.
informative. Yeah.
Well,
But it is something that like
you've kind of
you'll
inspired
grow as
me.
you, yeah. Yeah?
Yeah, yeah, you've kind of inspired me. I'm like, dang it, now I need to make gauge swatches more beyond just when I'm designing, because I gauge swatch for those all the time. But like if I'm making someone else's pattern, I'm like,
Mm.
oh, I guess I'll gauge swatch.
And then throw it right in the
So if
trash,
you were
apparently.
throw it right in the trash. Yes, exactly. Because I do not need to keep this gauge swatch. Well, I think that's another thing a lot of people will complain about is that they're like, well, I don't want to waste any of the yarn in a gauge swatch. So
Yeah,
I am going to just start the project. But then on the flip side, I would argue that I'm like, well, if you mess up the project because you didn't gauge swatch, so it's not even the right size, you've wasted that yarn and that time anyway. You might as well have used the gauge swatch. Boom. Okay,
it's
there we
true.
go.
You could also, I've seen a lot of people do this. They make a gauge swatch and then they don't cut the yarn. You basically just like look at it on the needles or on the hook and determine that you have the right gauge and then just rip it out and use all that yarn still for the project. So you wouldn't like cut the yarn and save
For
the swatch.
some,
You would just like rip
right.
it out and then like
I mean,
use
that would
their
really work for some of the fibers because I know if you make anything with
mm.
mohair or like a
Oh, forget it.
singles wool, like though I'm like, no, you can't, you're not salvaging that yarn. Just
Oh yeah.
cut
That's
it and
gonna
throw it
rip
away
right
or
away.
make a
Yeah.
scrapbook out of it.
A
Yeah.
scrapbook. Yeah, see? There you go. I think a
Yeah.
scrapbook or a quilt would be like so nice and like such a great way to commemorate all your projects in one place. So yeah, I'm still stuck on that
Oh,
idea.
I mean, look at your yarn wall behind you if anybody can see it. It's like you're like the everything becomes artwork for you. I'm like the only thing
It's
that's part
true,
of the
yeah.
art is the final piece. Nothing else that went into it.
Nothing else? No, I guess maybe that is part of it. I do find ways to put art everywhere. So it would be kind of nice. And, I like when my art has a story of like, oh, I painted this when I was feeling down. And that's, this painting was my muse or like, other crafts that I get into. I like to kind of have like some kind of story behind it. So it'd be really nice to like
So
have that craft book or something.
I think that actually tracks pretty well for you because I think one thing I note is that your desire to keep all of these pieces and your swatches are now becoming something where you're like, well, the swatch itself is going to be a piece of art that I'm going to hold on to. You're becoming more
Hmm.
careful in applying that. You like documenting literally every step of the way, and every piece
Yeah.
of it is demonstrated like and displayed later. That kind of
Yeah.
sounds to me like that's your approach almost when you do your social media, your YouTube posts, things like that.
Yeah.
You're kind of doing that same thing. You're like, I am demonstrating, I'm on display. I want to document all of this along the way.
It's
Whereas for
true.
someone like me, I am not documenty. I do not document every single step of things. A lot of times I'm actually like, this is going to interfere with my ability to just enjoy the moment. And I will just
Hmm.
document certain things. And that's going to be what I put out. And so my
Yeah.
own social media, my own YouTube may not be as prolific, but it's like everything I'm putting out there is a little bit more like it's been more thoughtful. Like I'm not documenting a
Hmm.
process. I'm documenting here's the final product kind of thing.
Yeah. 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 Well, I
Which then
think
ties
for
back into
sure.
process versus product knitters. So
Yes,
yeah.
it's true. Well, I think, having at least the final product on my social media at some level is like definitely, I want that for sure. I actually still need to document these gloves. um,
Mhm.
but I like having it on there because it's like for me when I just want to look back on my life and like scroll through, I love seeing all the projects. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that one, and wow, I can't believe it's been that long since I made it or whatever. But adding the like week by week updates for all the projects, I just thought was like a nice way to kind of like keep people involved. Our last episode was all about community, so kind of like ties in with
That's
that.
true.
And um, we talked a lot here about documenting our craft with like that the gauge swatching and the scrapbook and everything. So it's like kind of my online scrapbook. for me, that hopefully people enjoy. And
Yeah.
if not, if anything, it's something I can look back on years later and enjoy.
Yeah, and that's all that matters is like what is going to bring you joy. And if that brings you joy as well as anybody else who wants to partake in that, you're like, there we go. That's why you document. That's why you give all that. I guess like I understand that because I have done ones where I'll document certain parts where I'm like, here's where I'm at. Here's where I'm at on this sleeve. Here's where I'm at on these shorts that I'm designing, so on and so forth. So it's not to say
Hmm.
I've never done that before. But I think another thing is that sometimes I'll put pressure on myself if I document publicly, I'm in the middle of working on this, and then I post nothing else about that same project for a long time. I'm
Yeah.
like, well, now I'm almost feeling like I've given you a glimpse into something that is never to be. Or I'm like, well, now
Yeah.
I feel like I'm on a
True.
timeline. I'm like, I need this to be finished and be like, there's a beginning, a middle, and end to the story. Like, I
Yeah.
remember there was a post I recently did where I was like, I finished these shorts, watch for a tester call soon. And then decided, oh, I'm not ready for a tester call yet. We're going to do that in the spring. And so, so this post is like, now I'm like, well, I've got this embarrassing post of watch for this soon.
No,
So
it's not
that may be why
embarrassing.
I'm like, sometimes I don't document the process. I'm like, well, if I do a product, I'm like, this is finished. Like, I don't have any
Yeah, it's
expectation to
true.
post anything else about this. Yeah.
But if you're just only doing the products, then think about how often you actually get a final product. If I think back to 2025, I don't have very many final products from there, but I have a lot of process videos, Like I have a lot of the
Yeah.
process of making it because I was constantly making something. But when I look at the actual items, I don't have that many. So like even
That's
like the
true.
same for like gauge swatching or something, even if you like make the gauge swatch and don't end up making the project, you could still look back on the gauge swatch and be like, oh yeah, I remember that failure too. Like it can be part of it as well. Or sometimes like
That's
for the
so cute
gauge
how you
swatch,
even.
go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, like you when you did like this little number, it was like that was so cute. It's like you're holding up
Oh,
a
like
little
because
like
it's like
doll
a gauge
dress or something,
swatch.
like my little kid.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry. Okay, go on.
Well, I was gonna say sometimes too, I'll instead of the yarn I actually want to use, I'll use like some throwaway yarn, that I know is the same size, and I'll make my gauge swatch out of that so I
Mhm.
don't have to use the nice yarn. But actually I want to stop doing that
Ooh.
because I like the idea of the gauge swatch actually matching the pattern. So it could be like a visual
Okay.
representation. So anyway, I mean,
Ah.
I think that's probably about it that we've got on gauge swatching. It's really up to you if you want to do gauge swatching or you want to just go in right from the jump and get right into your project. It's kind of risky, but sometimes it can work. So I'm definitely interested to hear from y'all in the comments. Like, do you guys do gauge swatching or do you skip that step right off the jump? If you're following us on YouTube, then definitely give us a like and hit the bell notification so you know when our next episode comes out. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and welcome to the community here.
Definitely. Please subscribe. Yes, absolutely. And once you do that, then that means that you're able to keep up with everything we're doing. So you can join us for our next episode 2 weeks from now, where we would love to talk about the next fiber arts project that we're excited about. We know it's going to be a great episode. In the meantime, we
Yes.
hope you all have a wonderful and fantastic day. And thank you so much for watching.